Giuseppe Morello was born on May 2, 1867 in Corleone, Sicily, to parents Angelina Piazza and Calogero Morello. Morello's parents would only have one more child together before Calogero died on May 24, 1872. His sister Maria was born on February 28, 1872. After the death of Calogero, Angelina would marry Bernardo Terranova on July 30, 1873. From 1874 to 1892, they would have 7 children together. In the mid to late 1880s, Bernardo, who was a member of the Corleonese Mafia, would have Giuseppe Morello inducted into the organization. During his time in Sicily, Morello would get heavily involved in counterfeiting, and by 1892, he had committed at least 2 murders for the organization and was now a very high-ranking member. During this time, he would decide to leave Sicily and emigrate to the United States. This was likely due to his impending arrest on counterfeiting charges. Upon arriving in the US, Morello would settle in New York City. Even during this time, New York City already had a heavy Sicilian mafia presence, with members such as Michele Caramonte and Giuseppe Esposito leading their own families in the 1860s and 70s respectively. Despite this, Morello would not get involved in criminal activity at first. While he was away in the US, his son Calogero was born in November 1892. Shortly after the birth of his son, Morello would have his family join him in New York sometime in 1893. In 1894, the Morello Terranova family would relocate to Louisiana, where Morello and his stepfather would start several businesses, most of which failed. The following year, they would move to Texas, where Morello's wife and mother of his son, Rosa Marsalisi, contracted malaria, resulting in her moving back to Corleone and eventually passing away in 1898. In 1897, the family would finally settle in New York. After years of trying to establish legitimate businesses, Morello would begin running several criminal operations alongside other Corleonese mafiosi in and around 107th Street in East Harlem. It's likely Morello returned to New York in part to capitalize on recent arrests and convictions of several Sicilian counterfeiters who ran a criminal enterprise that spanned all of New York City. The remnants of this previous organization was now likely absorbed into Morello's organization. Morello's most profitable operation at this time was counterfeiting. He mainly distributed counterfeit $2 and $5 bills using young members of his own organization and Irish gangsters. By 1900, Morello's family associate, Calogero Maggiore, was the primary distributor of counterfeit bills. After a while, one of the Irish men Morello had moving counterfeit bills was arrested, and his information implicated Maggiore and Morello, who were both arrested. Morello was eventually released due to lack of evidence. However, Maggiore was convicted and sentenced to 6 years in prison. After this, Morello no longer hired non-Sicilians and worked to further insulate himself from criminal activity by creating an intricate structure that would have him at the head of the organization, with several capos under him who each controlled their own territories and soldiers. Morello's family was now very well organized and incredibly powerful. As a result, Morello was elected boss of all bosses and ranked above every Italian mafia boss in the United States. While Morello was consolidating his power, a young and ambitious gangster named Ignazio Lupo had just arrived in New York City. Born in Palermo, Sicily in 1877, he fled in 1898 to escape a murder charge. Lupo moved to Liverpool, England, Montreal, Canada, then Buffalo, New York, before eventually settling in Manhattan, New York City, where he opened up a grocery store and a saloon. Early on, Lupo would join forces with Morello and would lead many territories once run by a previous organization which was predominantly made up of Palermitani members. Lupo would also eventually move his family out to New York, including his brother Giovanni and his father Rocco. In 1901, Lupo would expand his businesses in Manhattan. He would open a saloon at 8 Prince Street, which was frequented by gangsters and counterfeiters. 8 Prince Street was also the address of a restaurant owned by Giuseppe Morello on the other side of the building. Morello and Lupo would also become partners in their criminal businesses, with Lupo importing counterfeit US currency from Sicily in olive oil cans for their families to sell. This wasn't the only source of revenue for the Lupo family. Ignazio Lupo was heavily involved in black hand extortion business. The Black Hand as a simple means of generating revenue for a small criminal enterprise went back many years and was very prominent back in Sicily. Lupo, however, found a way to organize it and turn it into a large-scale operation that covered many neighborhoods throughout New York City. Morello also got involved in this business. What he did was offer his services as a mediator between the Black Hand extortionists and the wealthy Italian businessmen who were victimized. For example, if Ignazio Lupo had one of his lieutenants extort an Italian businessman for $4,000, Morello would then charge $2,000 to get the extortionists to leave them alone. In 1902, Morello and Lupo would conspire to kill a man named Giuseppe Catania. Catania owned a grocery store in Brooklyn, but was likely a member of the Morello crime family, as he knew a lot about their counterfeiting operations. Catania also drank heavily and often talked too much. As a result, Giuseppe Morello and high-ranking Palermitani gangster Domenico Pecoracco would order his death. On July 23, 1902, Catania would be lured to his death by Ignazio Lupo, who had him beaten and killed. Catania's body was dumped on the riverbank at the Bay Ridge near 73rd Street in Brooklyn, where it was later discovered. Upon inspection, it was found that Catania's throat had been deeply cut from ear to ear, and his body was likely dumped from a moving cart. From this point, Morello and Lupo were inseparable, and were partnered in almost every one of their criminal enterprises. Lupo would even later marry Morello's half-sister, Salvatore Terranova. This would bring great prosperity to their respective families, at least for now. On December 31st, 1902, 3 low-ranking Morello family members were arrested by the Secret Service for selling counterfeit bills. The 3 men, Isodoro Crecovera, Giuseppe Gagliombardo, and Giuseppe De Primo, were caught in Pittsburgh with several counterfeit bills. High-ranking Morello family enforcer, Vito La Duca, was also later tracked down and arrested for overseeing the operation. After they were arrested, De Primo's brother-in-law, Bendito Madogna, raised $1,000 for his defense. Madogna sent this money to Morello, who pocketed it. Later, on March 13, 1903, all except La Duca would be convicted and sent to Sing Sing prison. This resulted in Madogna reaching out to Morello and arranging a meeting. On April 12th, they met at a cafe owned by Lupo family captain Pietro Inzerillo. During this meeting, Madogna accused Morello of neglecting his soldiers and not looking out for their interests. He also demanded Morello return his money. While he was sitting with Morello, the family top enforcer, Tommaso the Ox Petto, approached from behind and slit his throat. Madogna's body was then stuffed into a barrel from the cafe. They placed the barrel containing his body on a cart they allegedly sourced from Lupo family member Giovanni Zarcone and dumped it in the middle of East 11th Street in Manhattan as a clear message. The barrel was discovered early on April 13th and reported to the police. NYPD Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino, who was one of the few Italian members of the police department, began working to identify the body. Eventually, he visited Sing Sing prison to interview certain inmates, including Giuseppe De Primo. De Primo was shown a photo of Madogna and was able to identify him. He told Petrosino that the victim was his brother-in-law who lived in Buffalo and was married to his sister. The NYPD were eventually able to ascertain that the murder of Madogna was likely linked to the Morello and Lupo family's counterfeiting operations. This resulted in the arrests of Giuseppe Morello, Tommaso Petto, Pietro Inzerillo, and Ignazio Lupo. Also arrested was Domenico Pecoracco and some other Morello family members. When Petto was arrested, he was found to be in possession of a pawn ticket and a gold watch, both of which were traceable to Madogna and were identified by his eldest stepson, Salvatore D'Aquila. On May 8th, all except Petto were released due to lack of evidence. However, Petto would eventually be released on January 29, 1904 after Sagliabene recounted his statement and De Primo refused to testify. Upon his release, Morello advised Petto to leave New York in order to avoid the heavy scrutiny and surveillance from law enforcement. Petto agreed to this, and he, his wife, and their 2 children moved to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, where he set up a Black Hand extortion racket. During his time in Pennsylvania, Petto would also get involved in interstate transportation of unlicensed cigars. While Petto was building up his criminal empire, Giuseppe De Primo would be released from prison. De Primo didn't forget about how the Morello family stole his money and killed his brother-in-law. As soon as he was released, he began plotting to kill everyone involved. Late at night on October 21st, 1905, Tommaso Petto had just concluded business at his butcher shop. While he was walking home, he approached a dark alley near his house, and he was allegedly caught by De Primo. De Primo shot him multiple times before fleeing the scene, causing him to die instantly. late 1902, Giuseppe Morello first showed interest in the real estate business and banking. At this time, there were many southern Italians immigrating to New York City's working class neighborhoods. Due to this, there was a high demand for affordable housing, and this came in the form of tenement buildings. However, by 1904, the demand for affordable housing had begun to outweigh the supply. This gave Morello the idea to monopolize the construction industry and build affordable housing for Italian immigrants. He also built and operated an immigrant bank, which grew to be one of the largest banks in New York among Sicilians. The company overseeing these projects had Giuseppe Morello as president, with Ignazio Lupo as his partner, and 4 of his associates from Corleone as directors. Morello saw that this would be a very lucrative business and began selling shares to his criminal associates and legitimate businessmen throughout New York City. The company was named after wealthy Sicilian businessman and politician Ignazio Florio. The reason for this was likely to give the company an air of legitimacy and enhance the credibility of it with Sicilian Americans. For a long time, the enterprise ran very smoothly. The Morello and Lupo families had successfully diversified their revenue streams, with many legitimate and criminal businesses all running simultaneously. By 1906, they were even able to increase their cooperative stock to 2,000 shares each, worth around $100. Morello would even hand ownership of 2 Manhattan tenements to Ignazio Lupo and other 2 neighboring tenements to Pietro and Zerillo. However, in October 1907, New York faced a financial panic. Around this time, the New York Stock Exchange almost collapsed, and most banks were facing mass withdrawals, with clients believing that the banks would fail soon. As for the housing market, it greatly declined due to oversaturation and resulting lack of demand. Due to this, the cooperative failed, and shareholders lost their money. The treasurer of the company claimed that Lupo and Morello were the only ones that didn't lose any money from the fallout. As a result, legitimate shareholders threatened Morello with legal action, and the criminal shareholders threatened Morello's life. Although Morello had a lot invested in Ignazio Florio Co-Operative, his criminal enterprise was still his priority, and he had started to put things in place to start a large-scale counterfeit operation. In 1906, he and his capos Salvatore D'Aquila and Vincenzo Giglio bought some farmland in the New York Highlands and sourced several cheap printing presses from Ignazio Florio Co-Operative director Antonio Malone. At first, the notes were very poor quality, and the Morello family was unable to move them. This resulted in Morello trying to find a professional printer who could create sophisticated counterfeits. This would come in the form of Antonio Comito. Comito was a 28-year-old Calabrian man who worked as a printer in Calabria before moving to South America and eventually New York in June of 1907. Comito settled on James Street in Lower Manhattan, where he found work as a printer and joined the Sons of Italy. The Sons of Italy was a charitable group that provided support for Italian immigrants in New York. It was through this group that Comito met an associate of the Morello family in November 1908. The man told Comito of an opportunity to work for a friend of his in Philadelphia as a printer for $20 a week. This man eventually introduced Comito to Antonio Cicala. Cicala was a capo in the Morello family who was assigned the task of finding a printer and overseeing the family's counterfeiting operation. Despite Comito's reservations, he eventually relented and took the job after increasing pressure from Cicala to do so. Cicala would then have Comito and his girlfriend shipped off to a farmhouse in the New York Highlands, where he was introduced to Salvatore D'Aquila and a mysterious Morello family member known as Uncle Vincenzo, who would act as an assistant to Comito. The first few batches were very poor quality, and the Morello family were unable to move them. Even though they now had a professional printer, they would still need a higher quality printing press. Comito told Cicala that this would also need a professional colorist. This resulted in him personally meeting with Morello. Morello agreed to invest in higher quality presses and was willing to offer one of his own men as a colorist. During his time working at the farmhouse, Uncle Vincenzo would tell Comito a lot about himself and the Morello family. He said that he fled Sicily in 1902 in order to avoid prosecution for a double murder he committed during a robbery. He also said that the Morello family was an exclusive Sicilian organization, but they would soon diversify their membership by inducting mainland Italians, including Calabrians. One night in February 1909, just as Comito was finishing a batch of counterfeit notes, 3 men came to the door. These men were Salvatore D'Aquila, Antonio Cicala, and Ignazio Lupo. Lupo arrived with a bag full of guns with modified bullets for D'Aquila and Cicala to distribute tribute to their soldiers. Lupo also mentioned that NYPD Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino had left for Sicily. The purpose of this trip was to gather criminal records of Sicilian gangsters who were operating in America in order to have them deported and prosecuted. Lupo expressed his hatred for Petrosino and the police to these men, recounting an incident that happened a few months ago when he was in one of his grocery stores and Petrosino walked in and punched him, knocking him down. Although there were many reasons for Morello and Lupo to want Petrosino dead, this was likely the final straw. Later, Lupo would go to Morello with the idea of having Petrosino killed. Morello agreed that it had to be done, but was hesitant to give his support while Petrosino was still in the United States, as it would certainly lead to scrutiny from law enforcement, which would affect their businesses. This was Morello's only reservation about killing Petrosino, so when he was sent to Palermo by the NYPD, his fate was sealed. By the time Petrosino arrived in Italy on February 21, 1909, the American Mafia already knew of his intentions, and the Sicilians were made aware through an Italian newspaper article and the subsequent confirmation of Morello. In America, Morello and Lupo got the boss of the Brooklyn-based Castellammarese family, Paolo Orlando, on board with the plan to have him assassinated. Orlando would support them and even provide the hitmen. In Italy, Petrosino worked hard to hide his true identity and was very careful when traveling from Genoa to Palermo. Arriving in Palermo on February 28, Petrosino checked into a hotel on the Piazza Marina under an assumed identity, thinking he had sufficiently covered his tracks. He began gathering intelligence and evidence on some of the highest-ranking Sicilian and Italian-American gangsters. He was spending most of his time in Sicily meeting with the American ambassador to Italy, William Bishop, who helped him gain access to Sicilian police records. On March 12, Petrosino was walking back to his hotel like any other night. He didn't think that anything was out of the ordinary and had been keeping a very low profile. However, Sicilian Mafia boss Don Vito Cascioferro had been keeping tabs on him, and as soon as Morello sanctioned it, he sent 2 Orlando family hitmen to kill him. Just as Petrosino was about to reach his hotel, he was caught by these 2 gunmen and shot multiple times. He died on the scene, and with that, he had failed his mission. The Palermo Police Department named many potential suspects but never made any arrests. The death of Petrosino was a great relief to the Morello and Lupo families. Petrosino was a major collaborator of the Secret Service, and together they made investigating Morello and Lupo their top priority. The Secret Service had lost the invaluable experience and wisdom of Petrosino, but they still kept trying to catch Morello and Lupo out. Morello in particular understood this, staying completely insulated and ensuring Antonio Cicala ran the family's counterfeiting operation very carefully. Although Cicala did his best to keep things running, one small mistake would bring everything crashing down. On November 15, 1909, Antonio Cicala would meet Morello family associate Salvatore Lucchino to sell him counterfeit bills. Lucchino was a frequent buyer of Morello's counterfeit bills. However, he had recently been recruited as an informant for the Secret Service. Prior to the transaction, the Secret Service agents gave Lucchino marked bills, which he would then use to pay Cicala for the counterfeits. After the exchange, Cicala would be stopped by Secret Service agents. He was caught with the marked money and arrested. The marked bills and information from Lucchino were enough for a judge to approve the arrest warrants for Giuseppe Morello and Ignazio Lupo. Salvatore Cina and Vincenzo Giglio and 3 others, Morello and most of the others, would be arrested by Secret Service agents on the evening of the 15th, with Morello and his half-brother Vincenzo Terranova being caught inside Morello's apartment on East 107th Street. Lupo would be arrested 3 days later on an unrelated extortion charge. The Highland farmhouse was raided and the printing presses were seized as evidence. The printer Antonio Comito and the colorist Giuseppe Calicio had already fled. Morello and his co-defendants would all retain expensive lawyers from prestigious law firms to represent them. Morello had never never handled any counterfeit currency himself, and he had no direct contact with Salvador Lucchino, so the prosecution's case against him initially seemed weak. Meanwhile, on the outside, Morello and Lupo's respective crime families were doing all they could to raise money for their defense. Mainly relying on extortion, Morello's half-brothers Ciro Niccolo and Vincenzo Terranova were collecting money from businesses in the neighborhoods controlled by the Morello family, and the Lupo family was doing the same thing but to a different extent. Lupo family captain Antonio Cincotta decided to send a blackhand letter to the Italian opera singer Enrico Caruso, demanding $2,000. Caruso paid, and this money contributed to Lupo's defense. While Morello and Lupo were awaiting trial, the Secret Service were able to track down both Antonio Comito and Giuseppe Calicchio. Calicchio would then be charged alongside the others, however Comito was ready to talk. He would recall his first meeting with Antonio Cicala and how he allegedly forced him to accept the job printing counterfeit bills. He would also recall his meeting with Morello, stating that he was the leader of the organization. Comito had given the Secret Service all they need to convict Morello and Lupo. On January 26, 1910, all defendants would go to trial. On the first day of the trial, Comito was called to testify. He told the court that he and his girlfriend were held captive in the Morello-owned farmhouse and was forced to work for very little money. Comito also stated that Morello's counterfeit bills were distributed all across the United States and Canada. Comito's testimony would conclude on February 2nd, and things were looking bleak for the Morello family. From this point, the prosecution introduced several witnesses who were able to corroborate Comito's testimony. On the 15th, the defense would introduce several character witnesses in order to paint the defendants in a better light, with Lupo taking the stand the next day to tell his life story. Unfortunately, these measures proved unsuccessful, as the next day the jury just took 35 minutes to convict all defendants. The same day, all were sentenced. Cina, Giulio, and Cicala were sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Calicchio got 17 years, with Morello and Lupo receiving 25 and 30 years respectively. The two other defendants, Giuseppe Palermo and Niccolo Stavestro, were sentenced to 18 and 15 years respectively. Antonio Comito received no time. He and his girlfriend fled to South America with help of the Secret Service. With Morello and Lupo in prison for the foreseeable future, their families needed new bosses. Immediately after they were convicted, each family was appointed an acting boss until their cases were reviewed. The position of boss of the Lupo family went to Lupo's brother Giovanni, the position of boss of the Morello family went to Giovanni Pecoraro, and the position of acting boss of bosses went to Orlando family boss Sebastiano Di Gaetano. Upon the failure of Morello and Lupo's appeals, their families would be appointed permanent bosses. Lupo's family would officially be taken over by Capo Salvatore D'Aquila, who would also take the position of boss of bosses, and Morello family would be taken over by Fortunato Lomonte. It was clear, however, that Morello's family had significantly weakened, being completely dethroned by the absolute powerhouse that was the modern D'Aquila family, and things would only get worse for the Morello family. On April 17, 1912, Morello's son Calogero would be gunned down on East 114th Street in East Harlem. On May 24th, the Morello family would lose their boss Fortunato Lomonte as a result of the war with the D'Aquila family. His brother Tommaso would take over as boss, but he would be murdered a year later. The D'Aquila family would win the war by backing D'Aquila loyalist Salvador Loyo-Cano to succeed the Lomonte brothers as boss of the Morello family. The Morello family were also engaged in a conflict with the Brooklyn-based Camorra, which would claim the life of Morello's half-brother Niccolo Terranova on September 7, 1916. The Camorra, however, would eventually lose their war with the Morello family after the arrest and conviction of their highest-ranking members in relation to the murder of Niccolo Terranova. In late 1920s, Morello and Lupo would have their sentences commuted by President Warren Harding. After this, Morello was visited by an underling of former acting boss Giovanni Pecoraro. Morello communicated to Pecoraro that Salvador Loyo-Cano would need to step down upon his release from prison. When Loyo-Cano refused, Morello had him assassinated. When Morello and Lupo were released from prison in early 1921, Salvador D'Aquila would order their deaths. D'Aquila likely viewed the assassination of Loyo-Cano as a threat to his power. The murder of Loyo-Cano also resulted in the Morello family splitting into two separate families. The family loyal to D'Aquila was headed by Gaetano Reina, and the family loyal to Morello was headed by Vincenzo Terranova. The war that ensued would result in the deaths of Vincenzo Terranova in 1922 and Giovanni Pecoraro in 1923. After Terranova's death, the Morello family would be taken over by virtually unknown mobster Giuseppe Joe Masseria. Masseria would appoint Morello as his underboss, allowing Morello to pull the strings from the shadows. War would end when it was clear that the D'Aquila family could overpower the Morellos and their main ally, the Castellammarese family, now led by Niccolo Schiro. However, Joe Masseria would grow increasingly powerful with the support of Morello. Giuseppe Morello was now in a great position. Prohibition had made him rich, with the Masseria family selling alcohol that was either distilled in makeshift breweries or sourced from Arnold Rothstein, who was importing it from Canada and the Caribbean. The Prohibition era also produced a new generation of mobsters. In 1923, Morello and Masseria would officially induct Charlie Luciano, Frank Costello and Vito Genovese into their family. Costello and Genovese weren't Sicilian, but were inducted in order to give the Masseria family an advantage over the more conservative D'Aquila family. By 1928, the Masseria family had formally inducted Frankie Yale alongside Calabrian gangsters and even Chicago-based gangsters Al Capone. Meanwhile, Ignazio Lupo would be reintroduced into the family he once led. He now controlled the D'Aquila family's extortion operation, likely taking over from Antonio Cincotta, who was gunned down in 1915. In 1928, Masseria and Morello would finally decide to move on Salvatore D'Aquila. They allied themselves with D'Aquila underboss Manfredi Mineo. Mineo agreed to have D'Aquila assassinated on the condition that he would be named boss in his place. Masseria and Morello agreed to do this, and on October 10th, Salvatore D'Aquila was gunned down on Avenue A in Manhattan. After this, there was a meeting between the families, and Masseria was officially named the new boss of bosses. However, Masseria wouldn't have the backing of the families for very long. In contrast to Morello's earlier reign, Masseria was viewed as tyrannical and intrusive, often making decisions affecting other families throughout the country. Over time, the New York families would grow disillusioned with Masseria's reign. One man who decided to capitalize on this was Schiro family captain Salvador Maranzano. Maranzano was set to take over the family as Schiro was getting ready to retire. By 1929, Maranzano was already networking, trying to get other families on side. First was Gaetano Reina. When Masseria found out about this, he and Morello conspired to have Reina assassinated. Morello had the idea to delegate this task to Charlie Luciano, who then ordered Vito Genovese to kill Reina. On February 26, 1930, Vito Genovese and Joseph Pinzolo caught Gaetano Reina outside his girlfriend's house on Sheridan Avenue in the Bronx. Reina was shot 3 times and would later die in hospital. This would kickstart the war between Masseria and Maranzano. Immediately before this, Maranzano would meet with both Masseria and Morello. During this meeting, Maranzano would begin to realize that Morello was the true power behind Masseria. During this war, Masseria would lose several key allies. Joseph Pinzolo, who was killed by Reina family members after Masseria appointed him their new boss. Manfredi Mineo, who was killed by Maranzano hitmen, and eventually Morello on August 15, 1930. Morello and his bodyguard Joseph Periano went to his office to collect cash receipts. Little did they know Maranzano hitmen Joe Velacci and Sebastiano Buster from Chicago, Domingo, were tailing them. With Velacci as the getaway driver, Domingo would rush into the building and gun down both Periano and Morello. The death of Morello absolutely crippled the Masseria family. It was now clear that Masseria would never be able to overpower the Maranzano family. As a result, Charlie Luciano would take his allies and defect to Maranzano's side. Luciano would arrange Masseria's death, with it being carried out on April 15, 1931. Luciano would then later have Maranzano assassinated when it was clear that Maranzano intended to have him and his allies killed. The final result of this was the Commission. Luciano raised the position of boss of bosses and brought together a board of directors that would maintain order amongst all families throughout the country. The Commission was initially made up of 5 New York families: Tommaso Galliano as boss of the former Reina family, Joe Bonanno as boss of the former Maranzano family, Vincent Mangano as the boss of the D'Aquila family, Joe Perfacci as the boss of his own family, Luciano as the boss of the former Masseria family, as well as Stefano Magaddino in Buffalo and Al Capone in Chicago, with Philadelphia and Detroit being added shortly after. As for Ignazio Lupo, he would likely be demoted in the now Mangano crime family when the American Mafia began relying less on Black Hand-style extortion. In 1932, he would be called before Luciano's National Crime Syndicate and stripped of most of all his rackets, only being left with the Italian numbers racket. In 1936, he would be arrested for extortion and sent back to prison, where he would serve 10 years, being released in December 1946 and dying 1 month later on January 13, 1947.